Welcome to Portals of Perception and to part 2 of the conversation with Rufus and Sylvie. In part 1, we reflected on the nature of the transformation underway now and the significance of this shift inside the bigger picture and the historical context, where there is a sense of a second renaissance arising and appearing in many different places all around the world. In this part 2, we reflect on the practical application, the practical translation of these ideas and the pursuit of art and philosophy and the interior and the exterior development, and how a group of people can come together to do the work, the hard endeavor of building intentional neighborhoods and collective endeavors, where there is a way of bridging the sense of the spiritual and the religious together with a practical, sustainable reality. Discover for yourself and find the encouragement for your endeavors with the communities and networks you are part of.
There's a breakdown in trust, and so the rupture of dialogue, when we see people can't talk to each other, is because there's no longer the foundation of trust. There's been a disruption of trust in regards to power. Like in the past, people would maybe trust the powerful one because they would trust that the powerful had the interests of the people at their heart, and vice versa. But there's a huge disruption in regards to trust. And this is where I think with modernity and the breakdown of religion came the destruction of morality and of ethics. And if you don't have that, if you don't have ethics, I move from morality to ethics because moral has a sense of bad and good and a judgment of the people. But ethics, I prefer to talk about the action of people. If you don't have trust and ethics, you don't have, and you're building something on quicksand. You're constantly doing the foundation because there's no trust. And you can't create a society where there's no agreement.
Well, you are describing the different lines of development that will have to be integrated if there is to be a societal structure that works, where morality and ethics and trust and agreement are some of those lines. So I'm interested that we explore a bit the communal side of the endeavor, because you just described how sometimes two people that live together, it can be pretty intense, right? Let alone, I say that anywhere you bring 5 people together to run a project or to run anything, it's always skating on the verge of breakdown and implosion, and yet we're looking at bigger, significant global issues, and there is a sense in which there is tremendous significance, even though we often may feel small. Oh, it's just the dozen of us or just the 20 of us, and yet those are imaginal cells where a new operating system can emerge. So I'm interested that you describe a little bit of the praxis lab and the communal endeavor, and what is actually occurring in this, and how are you approaching those through the various iterations that you have already gone through.
You talk then.
I mean, also I should just say for people listening, I think a great combination of Sylvie and myself. So I'm probably even on the spectrum. I'm autistic, and I did stuff in tech, and I do write poetry as well. So I've got some part of my right brain still there. And Sylvie's, definitely an artist, but somehow, maybe also has this other side of her. So we're kind of in that way a great combination of this dance. So just for my part, you'll get the more kind of, I wouldn't say like, maybe I'd like to say gardener mindset, but even engineering mindset of the kind of analytical part of it. Like we need to do X, Y, and Z. So to go back, to emergence, like metaphorically, we're all going, there's some mountain, maybe even multiple mountains we want to go to, which is the new paradigm. We call it an awakening society, or the second Renaissance is the period to get there. We talked a little bit about the feature of that, and people might have different. I think it's good that there are probably different versions of that. And then there's also the question of how to get there. Now, again, I think the best way is to sometimes, look at the past. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. So our view is just to say, our starting point was to say, okay, we don't know that there's this, new cultural code, if you like to use that term, or cultural operating system. Although I'm a geek, I'd prefer to use maybe more like a kind of garden. There's a new cultural ecology emerging. How do you support that or catalyze that? Not that we're going to ever make it happen, but be a support for those kind of things to happen. And so our approach, at least at Life Itself, one aspect, there are multiple, because Life Itself is like a collective. I should emphasize that. There's artists, there's research collective, there's different parts. But was to say, well, probably people have to live or work proximately. Even in this virtual age, I think we can be globally connected like we are now on this call, but particularly, I would actually say for, actually resolving conflict is very hard remotely. I've run a remote company for 20 years in various versions. So one of our theses was that basically there are going to be little seeds of experiment. We're going to be involved. There'll be others going on, but just to see as many of these seeds of cultural ecosystems emerging, they're probably going to be in very small areas, maybe start with hamlets, neighborhoods, regions. And that some of them, for some reason, will get to kind of a critical mass. They've got this challenge, if you're a new kind of plant, that the other plants are maybe inhospitable to you. You're operating inside of consumerist capitalism, and just in very practical terms, what's the cost of housing in your region? If you want to do stuff in San Francisco, you've got to earn a San Francisco salary. So suddenly that means you've got to work inside of normally a certain kind of company for a certain amount of time a week, et cetera. These are very practical constraints on having the time to form new cultural environments. So our logic was we were trying to see others and ourselves seed kind of neighborhoods like this. And we've now run for 5 or 6 years. We started out just running kind of events where we pop up kind of 1 week immersive events. People would come, we'd see what would happen. We called gatherings. We did various other activities, but we started in London, Berlin, and then near Paris, and now near Plum Village in Southwest France, trying to create these kind of, second Renaissance seedlings, and find others. We're not see what others are arising. That's the mapping, and visit them. So practically, that looks like actually trying to rent or buy space. We had this vision that you probably need both today, urban centers and you're not going to go to rural Missouri just and go back to the land. That's fantastic. And you maybe need some mix. So we have a hub in Berlin. There's a hub here in near, as I say, there's actually kind of 2 hubs. There's 2 spaces near Plum Village, one in the town and one in the countryside, and actually try it out, have people come live for shorter or longer periods, start trying to, we sometimes joke meta-modern monastery. People have this term meta-modern, maybe you've heard, but the idea of what would something that had the kind of psycho-spiritual intensity where people are really committed to this new paradigm or living differently, but they also are still working. What would it look like earning a living? The monasteries of the Middle Ages did, in theory, a bunch of them earn living, manufacture, make beer, grow crops. What do companies or enterprises look like with this new kind of operating system? So, we've built a small tech company. We've done a couple of other enterprises. So this is a part of really saying, from our perspective, I think people have got to forming these kind of, I now call them, I don't know, either intentional neighborhoods or conscious neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. Maybe not commune. They're not, not full on kibbutz. I love kibbutz. I'm a massive admirer of kibbutzes. I regret that I didn't get to live on a kibbutz. But and I just want to say that, by the way, people are skeptical. Another thing on this, I just want to make a complete riff and a sideshow for a moment. We live in an age of great cynicism in general. Maybe not people who listen to this, but one of the killers of this age is cynicism. It is this extinguisher of hope. Mm-hmm. And there's a great sense of things won't work out. And I find it funny, even because, I'm in the company I run and stuff. We've done stuff with many Israelis, and I've and many people are really dismissive about kibbutzes when I go there. I'm always like, my God, and they're always like, the kibbutzes didn't work. And this is an example where we live in an age. I always say, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was persuading you didn't exist. And we sometimes joke, the greatest trick that modern capitalism has ever pulled is persuading you no alternatives, exist. And it's like the kibbutzes in Israel produced 13% of GDP at their height in the 70s. Even today, there are as many kibbutzes as there were actually in the 80s. Some of them run multi-billion-dollar businesses. Now, it is true that the cultural environment is not hospitable to them right now. But you look, it produced many of the leaders of modern Israel. And that's democratic socialism. Now, maybe it didn't take over the whole of Israel and become the entire economy or something, but it's incredible. And I think people, the thing to realize is that, yes, we're going to, like startups, we're going to try a lot of experiments culturally, and some are going to just work. And in particular, the big thing we're trying to crack, you're trying to do two hard things. You need to be materially sustainable. You need to make enough money to eat, to have a house, whatever it is, to generate some surplus, and you need to be psycho-spiritually sustainable.
Yeah.
And just the obvious thing is that often if you go and live in high cost urban centers, you're spending all your time working, basically. You don't have enough surplus energy mostly to be psycho-spiritually. So one of the dances, like Joe Lightfoot and I have talked a lot about, and others, it's just what is this ingredient of what business plus what location plus what set of practices will actually be a mix that is scalable. I don't mean massively scalable, that we could have a region. So my dream is that we have a transformative region in the next few decades, and maybe multiple places in the world that really are oh, wow, this is the future being pioneered.
Right.
It's here around Bergerac. Come live around Bergerac. People are moving here. That's my sale pitch.
Yeah.
It's beautiful Southwest France. It's a tenth of the cost of London or New York. And, and you can work remotely. There's fiber and there are people coming.
So let me re-thread through some of the key elements. The reason there has to be a residential co-living or neighborhood dimension, because there is something about the locality and the connection with the land and the ecology that we create and all that enables, including having been privileged to be born and be raised in a kibbutz. And I can tell the story that you will not hear from most Israelis, because I have a very different perspective. Most of them are coming at it from the cynical, secular, and I will bring to it the esoteric dimension that most people are unaware of. But so there is that local dimension that you're describing in those prototypes and seeds of the future. And then you're saying there has to be a spiritual developmental propulsion in it. And I think what is very important, you also painted, which is part of the success of the kibbutz, there has to be an enterprise or an entrepreneurial, self-sustaining, and potentially there has to be an impacting the nearby ecology, some service capacity, because yes. Sylvie was describing earlier, you were describing how it is that when we serve something else is arising in us. In the case of the kibbutz, they were practically reliberating the land, so to speak, in their theology, and they saw this to be the salvation of Israel and of the Jewish line. And remember, most of these people, like my father, who then led the kibbutz and led the industrial center of the kibbutz and the factory of the kibbutz and made it a thriving success, they came from a very religious Jewish background. So there was a spiritual seeding in their childhood that after the Holocaust they say never again, and they liberated themselves, so to speak, into a secular life. But the kibbutz experience was very religious, not in a religious way, but in their ideology, they were totally religious.
They're totally religious. I mean, I think it had a purpose. I mean, we could get into unfortunately, Marxist. The point I would argue is that Marxist socialism that has this really good essence, but it has this kind of ontological naivety. It's naive about human nature. But we could, just to go back, I just want to say one thing. So one is, I think that the issue of being proximate physically, I don't know, I do a lot of stuff virtually. And I want to emphasize that I think the technological innovation that we're engaging right now, this kind of video call across the world, I think is actually also massive in enabling this, because what I'm talking about, which is seeding these these seedlings of a second renaissance, like we're kind of building a greenhouse, we're like incubating, all over the world, we hope, these kind of like shoots of the second renaissance. So traditionally you had to live and work in the same place, and your partner had to, and maybe your family had to, because you want to be close to your family. That was a lot of conditions. And it became particularly difficult in the modern times, because basically there's a huge move to big cities, because basically work gets more complex. It involves multiple different skills. So you all move, you need to be in New York or San Francisco or London. So there's this then it makes a house price too expensive. There's a whole bunch of things that made it very complicated to do things. Suddenly, with one thing that's really special right now is, because of the technological breakthrough that we have, you don't necessarily need to work anymore in the same place as everyone else. So that reduces this massive constraint. So typically, if I wanted to form a collective that was going to live a bit differently, we all have to be basically, somewhere near London or near New York or normally, unless we're going to go back to the land or some unusual situation. So suddenly you could have a job, you could have work, you can have enterprises that are virtual, or you do, or you commute a bit or something. And so that there's a suddenly loosening in the constraint. I'm thinking here in an I'm a mathematician, the constraint in our space of what we can create. So I think that is something very exciting right now about creating these kind of collectives. To go back, I think the other point to also make about virtual is that you can also not be so remote as a collective. You might be like in a collective, like, I don't know, somewhere south of San Francisco, or in, 50 miles from San Francisco, but you can also be connected to people virtually in New York, other collectives. So I think that's the other thing, is that we can have a global network of these kind of places, which are locally connected with their region, locally impacted. I think that is unfortunately, very important humanly. I think also connected with the land, I think somehow is quite profound. We could go into that, but also globally connected, glocal, as sometimes people say, globally, locally. We got the point. I'm getting excited, Sylvie. Sylvie should say something.
Well, there are so many other dimensions that I'm curious about here, and that obviously I have a deep experience in. I don't know if we need to cover everything in one call. We can do part 2 of this, but just to name some of these, the whole dimension of, going deeper, to what degree should, when you describe a collective, should there be a unified sense of the spiritual or the religious or the ritual nature? That's one line of inquiry. The whole aspect of the social agreement, all those dimensions, including how you're going to raise children. So I'm interested in any other aspect that you want to describe about that.
Well, I think I'd love to just say, it's hard. And
rewarding, but hard.
No, but it's definitely rewarding. But why I want to say it's hard, again, so I'm a child of modernity, and I grew up within a lot of American Walt Disney movie, which depicted life as a form of the American dream. It's hard, and then it's all good, and it's good, and it's good, and it's good.
And better.
And it gives you a delusional sense of life. And then there's a picture of the superhero that comes and saves the day, and it's individuals that save the day. It's not like a group of people who like talk their differences and do a lot of beginning anew, and like they're like very simplified narrative, and we've swam in them, and it create in French you say biaisé, it creates a bias or a distorted view of reality and distorted expectation. And I think the sense of cynical that we just mentioned is also due of that, is because in my personal journey, a whole part of growing up was to deal with the sense of disappointment, because I thought that life was supposed to happen a certain way from the media and the narrative I was given. And I think it's in reclaiming a different narrative, which is saying there is difficulty and there is light and liberation and solace when you embrace the difficulty on the other side. Life is not about trying to not have problems or not have difficulties. But most of the depiction of what people tell you is all they try to do is get rid of problems. Right? It's like, oh, I want to get rid of problems. But one thing is, you don't want to have problem be dead. Dead people don't have problems.
Yes.
And therefore, problems are an opportunity to growth. Now, if they're too big, if like it's just like, then they become a trauma, and there's no growth in that. It's like a reverse. And so now I want to kind of talk a little bit about the difficulty and the joy and the beauty of them.
Community as well.
In community. And so one, well, I'll talk from my personal experience is, funny enough, my Chinese name is Xi Wei, which means wild rose of hope. So there's no way you'll put the hope down out of me. But in the hope, there was parts that were very also delusional, because I think for many people who want to create an alternative, or many activists, are you activist or are you a reactivist? Are you trying to? It's often because you're trying to. You see that the perception is something's broken and something needs to be repaired. And that therefore comes from a wound and not from just a possibility. It comes from fixing. And so it's first, like for me in my personal journey, is to see that my action was not coming just from a joy, was coming from a hurt. And if my action come from a hurt, what do I cause? Hurt. Or what do I see? More hurt. Because I'm not in accepting my past. I'm not in accepting myself and the world and people as they are. And so I think living in community is a massive mirror exercise. Like you just, with lots of reflection, and and if there's not a lot of like love and acceptance, it creates that you think you're seeing a horrible picture, right? And it for me was also what I found fascinating in what we were doing. I was like, it's a bit crazy what we're doing, because most people who live together, they came from the same family, or they knew themselves since childhood. They had the same religion. They knew themselves since the diaper. They knew all the family history. There was a strong sense of trust. So you didn't have to verbalize things. You just knew people deeply. And now I'm trying to live with a guy that I don't know very well, that I might not, I think I share the same value, but probably we don't, because we come from different originating culture. And I'm trying to engineer something that is supposedly very natural. Guess what? It's going to probably not work. And the key is accept that it's not going to work, that it's not supposed to work in a way, because it will take time. It's like we've gone super individual, now wanting to rediscover or be collective ain't gonna work from the first go. And so it's accepting that we're modern individualist animals.
At least in the West.
At least in the West, you know, it's not.
In Taiwan, it's different, maybe.
Yeah. But I'm talking about the cultural context of Europe here.
Or
that
the US.
I don't know the US that much, but we're, at least in Europe, like you're an individualist modernist animal. You're used to having your private space and you're used to questioning everything. And if you're going to be in a collective, you can't spend your time questioning everything because it's just exhausting, right? And like there's a reason why Asian are very effective as a group, because they don't question as much. You know, like just simply put, you're told to do that, you do it. Like if you start to question and you're just like you dissolve in the questioning, and they don't question as much originally because there's a strong sense of trust, but there's also on the other side, it was also a very repressive authority. But that's a distraction on that. But what I mean is like, oh, you got to accept the creature that you are with its strength and its quality. And from that, you got to design, like look at, create practices to grow where your weaknesses are, where you want to grow. Let me finish. Yeah, so it's like if you have it's like you have a ladder and you're asking a 2-year-old to suddenly be able to like climb a ladder that he's physically not capable of. He'll always feel that he's failing. And it's not that he's actually failing, it's that this is not correctly, is not the right tool. And so for us in the journey, there has been a lot of like, I'm also very sensitive, but feeling like you hit your face on the floor and then thinking that it's because you're bad or you're a failure, rather than being like, oh, I gotta start from where I am, right, and where I would like it to be, and accept the strength and weakness of my current culture and take it one step at a time. And so some of the practice hubs is like having a space for the modern animal to rediscover, and this awkward re-engineering how to be together again, and do it at a pace that we can process it, that we can integrate it, versus just having a rupture and another breakdown, another trauma about the collective.
Let me ask a couple of clarifying questions. So, so one of the important dimensions I'm gleaning from what you're describing, there are some people who are locally in the same co-living or neighborhood, and then there is the event organizing, facilitating dimension of people coming from outside. And actually there is, because that can be a metabolism that will facilitate something. Is that part of the equation or not?
Yes. So we just take certain lessons. So one lesson, I guess, that's very obvious maybe is like I've said several times today on the call, like a move from maybe saying even conscious community to conscious neighborhoods. So one lesson at least in
co-living.
Yeah. So, you know, if you want to like live long term together, which is like full on commits, you want to have a very slow selection process. And you want to think a lot about that. So the idea of neighborhood, just to mention, is to say, okay, actually, if you start in the West, people want to live maybe in the same town or very close, but having their own space. You could do it in a community as well, but this thing, maybe it's a really obvious learning, and you read some other books. But one thing out of our experience in the last 5 or 6 years was just like, hey, that's a big thing in that, like it's just that individual space, other things is a big deal.
Is there any screening, any screening dimension?
Yeah, exactly. The other thing the other thing that we learned that I think was about some of our praxis hubs, where we started to call them praxis hubs, is that people should come. I think we're moving, and it's been over the last 2 years, to more of an incubator model, which was one of the lessons was also to say, hey, people need to come for a period. There is now a core group at a practice hub who are either living or living close by, who manage it all the time. But as you say, then people are coming. We might run, what we're interested particularly in was what we called like sustained ontological development, fancy term. But what I mean is the other thing we're interested in is what is the growth people need to want to go through, and how does it sustain? You know, one of the things that intrigued us was, you know, I've gone on a retreat, you know, you come back after a week, it's like, oh my God, I've seen it, I need to change my life. And then, you know, 3 weeks later, you're back doing zero meditation, whatever. How do people sustain it? And so in our case, we moved some of the practice hours, particularly one of them here in Bergerac, to be like, people come for between like 2 weeks and 3 months or 6 months. Do people come for sustained periods? And the dance we're in at the moment is how do people live differently, but still do their normal life, not have quite the retreat model. And then this be an incubator. So where we're moving towards is then some percentage of those people, because the other thing is a lot of people say, oh, I want to live more in community, or I want to live more in a neighborhood. But then when it comes to it, they're like, oh, actually, you know, no bad thing. Actually, you know, I don't. Actually, there's, you know, I don't want to have to come to a group meeting every month or every week, or have to cook dinner once a week for others and share, you know, I love it, but I also, it's a hassle or something. So the model at the moment we're thinking is that people coming, there's this kind of these developmental programs, and also the aspect of trying to live together for some period as a pilot where they still do their normal job. And then some percentage of those say, oh, I want to go and start something, or I want to live in a neighborhood like this. Okay, great. The next stage is how are you going to set that up like a startup? How are you going to find others? How are you going to find capital to buy a space or rent a space? How are you going to how are you going to sustain yourself financially? So almost this model of like, how do you have many more of these happen? I mean, I could come back to the lessons and we could talk about education. I mean, there's so many. What does the education of the future look like? How does it operate in these kind of environments? I mean, the kibbutz was obviously very unusual and fascinating in many ways, many of the kibbutzes. But just to come back, I mean, there's a lot of humility, but there's also a lot of like hard-won knocks about how I would do this now and how. And I think I just want to emphasize, I think the key here is you're trying to get to sustained. You know, I think something happens, you know, like everyone could go on a week, you know, my blunt thing, we've run several events. If you run a week workshop, people leave and they're like, oh my God, it was amazing, transformed my life. If you go and study their life, you know, in my view, about a month or 6 months later, some people, there is something that shifts, but it's a very small minority. Many people, the thing is, you have people come for a month. You know, often we do a week workshop at the beginning of a month. They'll have conflict, they'll have fights with other people in the community. And we're like, that's the best thing. They may not like that as much, but that's when the growth happens. If you can go through conflict, if you can transform that, if you can start seeing your own shadow, and believe me, Sylvie and I have seen a lot of our shadow living in community, all the things that you haven't dealt with as yourself, all the ways that you're whatever, this way or that way, or reactive, or, you know, dominating, or whatever else there is about you. I mean, you keep being shown it. That, you know, but that's, I think, the thing. And we're particularly interested in this sustained growth and sustained culture, you know, and that I think takes time. You know, it's what happens in the monastery traditionally. It's what happens in long-term coaching or long-term, you know, transformative practice. And that I don't have the answer. That's the other thing I'm very interested in. How does that happen? What ecology of practices do you need to catalyze people shifting to true second person perspective, for example? That's pretty essential. Not always as common, even in myself, as I would like second person perspective when it comes to who should have made the dinner.
Well, you just described there a menu for several follow-on conversations and explorations.
Yeah.
I suppose just to wrap up this element and then to land perhaps with what are you looking forward to. I'm interested to just explain. You used the word sustain, and it's interesting what it evoked in me, because something in me said, is sustain sufficient? Or is it truly that the universe is a system whereby its economy is based on energy? So one of the ways I look at this is that whatever the universe loves it dumps more energy into it. And so what is the universe, what does the universe love more than anything else that it supports with energy? Life and the evolution of life. So there is the sustaining of life and there is the evolution to become, and so there is I don't know if you feel comfortable with a trajectory, a developmental, perhaps even teleology dimension to it. And then my inquiry is, if we were to explore this in the communal or a network or whatever the language is, what is the way in which we may be able to integrate the sense of we're serving the discovery of our individual purposes and callings, and at the same time, in some ways, in the laboratory that you are creating, you are becoming a service agency of evolution itself through you, and to the degree that people are able to wrap their minds, not just their minds, but their life and heart and soul, then there is a representational dimension to life. I'm no longer just living for myself. Now, I may be projecting my bias because it is so deeply ingrained in my formation, but what I've seen, actually both in the work I do in the corporate world and also in developmental intentional communities, sometimes the unlock is when we are able to endeavor in the most personal, individual way by way of seeking to do so on behalf of the universal and the communal. I don't know if that resonates, but I'm interested, how do you pull these, the individual propulsion and what is the new we that you're looking to create, and how much this we is in service of something bigger than itself?
Hi. Rufus was just saying, look happy, because when I'm very focused, I frown. I frown really hard when I'm focused. I would say the key thing right now, most people who are listening to us, there needs, as you said in the beginning, there's a huge acceleration in the world. And because it accelerates so much more, you got to slow down farther more.
Yes.
You got to real slow down. And it's really, really hard to slow down when everything goes fast, when everything is pulling you to go fast and think and find a solution. You got to real slow down so you can discern. Because when you go fast, what goes on? That goes on. You can't see, you can't have perspective, you can't distinguish things. And when things goes really fast around you, therefore you got to try to stay still. Now I say it because I'm someone that I found very hard to stay still. Very hard to stay still because it's so attractive to be pulled by the desire, to be pulled by that movement. But I think what instinctively, intuitively tells me is that what it would be wise right now is to slow down and not even to just claim just yet to have fully the answer, but tune into what's going on and discern what comes up, and to be able to discern, because so much in all that noise, in all that movement, you got to calm down, because that movement is a lot of the movement I see. Some of it is something of emerging of the future, but I see a lot of the movement coming from panic.
Yes.
Coming from utterly fear and panic.
Yes. Yes.
So in what I just said is like, I think in serving today is to not give in to the fear and the panic and the movement and etc., but to slow down and discern what goes inside and outside. And let the work on you. Trust the practice. Have faith in the practice. Whatever your practice is, it might be praying, it might be meditating, it might be chanting, personal development. It might but you gotta have faith and give yourself to a practice and let the practice work on you. And some practice have been existing for thousands of years, And that if they've been around for that long, it's probably because they work. And have faith in those practices that live through time and live through your ancestors, that our ancestors have passed on to us. And why I say that, it's also in my personal journey. It's very recent for me to go and explore the dimension of faith of practice, faith in something bigger than myself. And why I talk about practice and something bigger than ourselves, the practice is the access to something bigger to yourself. You can't access it without the practice. And I used to have such resistance and fear of forms of praying or meditation and etc. And I've gradually started to trust, in a way, as I said, my ancestors, that why are people still praying? Why are people still meditating? It's been 2,000 years. Something is like there's a truth in that. There's and give yourself to the practice. Don't think too much. And I especially say that to intelligent, smart people like you and I, because it goes really fast in there, and the mind is an illusion. The mind thinks that understanding it is it, but understanding is not it. It has to be embodied through a practice, through an experience. So don't, like, I would say things very differently if I was speaking to an Asian audience, but for a Western audience, I say, don't think too much, do a practice.
Yeah. Well, this has been a rich, very rich conversation, and I feel like the first in perhaps a series of explorations. I'm called to ask as an exit question, and I don't know if it's the right one, but I'm just going to go with the flow. How has parenting re-architected or changed your endeavor, other than in every possible way and the most dramatic way, I'm guessing?
Yeah. Well, I think, it seems so simple, but I think the two of the relationships that are the most demanding in transformation are your love relationship and your parent-child relationship. Like if you just have those relationship and use those not use like utility, but like embrace those as a practice, as a vehicle for transformation. Like, there's so much. And yes, because your children, I think when I became a mother, it was really clear to me before becoming a mother. And so when did Atian become? Did Atian become when he was born physically, or he became when he was already existing into my awareness that I wanted to have a child? What's that moment? And I think that and it was really clear to me that children land into a context that are full of transmission. And if we as adults can complete our past, complete our suffering, then we can be more of a space for our children to arise as themselves, and versus our projection, versus putting onto them our fear, our anxiety, our concern, even our desires, our hope. I couldn't be this, so I want them to do it for me, and children ultimately also in the modern perspective is like they're my children, the ultimate belonging, right? They're more yours than your iPhone, right? You gotta have a say in like how you gotta, and that's for me the ultimate modern disillusion, that the children are yours. The children are not yours. They don't belong to you. They belong to the world, to themselves and the world. You're the privileged guardian of guardian of them for a time being. And they're really our Zen masters, because they're really mirrors effect. Because the magic with children and in your love relationship, in some of your relationship, you can keep a face, you can keep it nice, you can put your best,
put on your makeup
and show up the best version of yourself. When you're constantly with someone, and as when you live in community, you can't keep up.
No man is a hero to his valet.
You can't keep up the good looking. And so all your flaws, all your suffering, all becomes transparent and visible. And we don't want to be seen in such a vulnerable way, and so they become, and our children knows us by heart. And so because they know us by heart, and your partner knows you by heart, they're one of the greatest access for growth and transformation. And finally, I want to finish with something about children and community. Children are the glue to community.
Yes.
So one of our problematic that I see is in our community, there's no children currently. What naturally happens, usually how community forms, there are kids. What happens? Kids play together. The moms hang out. The dad hang out, and they make sure they have good relationship because the kids play together. Children are really the glue, the heart beating of community. If the community does not have kids, it does not have really much of a future.
Yeah. You're describing my childhood, and you're also describing the childhood of our son. We were raising our son the first 6 years still in an intentional community where so my wife, that's exactly was the way of living. The children will get together, and the mothers will hang together and will actually console and support and encourage and take care of each other, and both in the emotional, communal, and in the practical sense.
Yes.
So there is an invitation you made there that perhaps is what we can take from as we live today. When you describe the transmission sense that when we live as parents, when we live in communities, just the way we live our life is the transmission we make into our life and into our ecology. And the one other thread that is continually working for me in the background from everything you're sharing is the sense that what you were describing in the sense of activation of the new religion, and probably the word needs to change. Probably it's a different word, but that sense of something else that and it's more even than re-enchanting the world that modernity left us with. It really is about truly birthing.
Yes.
The new sense organs and ways of being and the retethering to the ineffable that is rediscovering its beloved humanity through our endeavor. That's me flying upside down, describing it as something else that's seeking to reconnect with us while we seek to reconnect with it. So there is just so many starters here to be taken up and developed. And I just thank you so much for the richness, the openness, and the testimony of you living in the laboratory of your life. Just so beautiful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you
so much. Bye-bye.
Along with our website at portalsofperception.org, Portals is also available on YouTube and on all podcast platforms, as well as social media. You can become an active member and join the conversation in community events. And you can help us get the word out by liking this content and by sharing it with your friends.